This is a C55 AMG by Mercedes-Benz, and it's an excellent sleeper, great daily driver, and truly one of my favorite sports sedans of the early 2000s.
The W203 C-Class delivers excellent understated styling, brutal performance, intoxicating soundtrack, and daily drivable comfort, and it does all that on a budget. I've owned this car for about 2 years now, and it's been a great vehicle to have as a car enthusiast with a family. Today, I'm going to review this C55 AMG sedan and show you why it's such a great car and still feels fast and fun to drive even nearly 20 years later. And of course, go over all of its nuances and gadgets. The W203 was Mercedes-Benz's internal model code for this version of the C-Class, which was sold from 2001 through 2007. The W203 had two high-performance AMG versions, the C32 AMG, which was sold from 2002 to 2004 in the US, and the C55, which was only sold for 2 years in 2005 and 2006, with most of those being 2005 model year cars. For the next gen C-Class, the W204, the C55 was replaced with the C63 AMG, which sported an even bigger 6.3-liter V8. It is also interesting to note that the evolution of the W203 AMG models mirrored the previous generation C-Class, the W202, which also had two AMG versions, the C36 AMG and the C43 AMG, which were V6 and V8 respectively. So the C55 wasn't the first time that AMG stuffed a V8 into the C-Class, and it wasn't the first time that a C-Class generation had two different AMG variants over the course of the model. Now, many automotive journalists and car enthusiasts like to compare the C55 to its other German compact car competitor, the BMW E46 M3. However, one big difference is that the M3 was available in coupe or convertible only, whereas the C-Class was available only as a sedan. Yes, there was that weird-looking C230 compressor model that was kind of a coupe hatchback, but there was no AMG version of that, so we'll ignore it for now. However, Mercedes did have a similar segment high-performance coupe and convertible at the time, which was the CLK. Now, some may argue that was not really an M3 competitor, but just throwing it out there, and we'll get into why the C55 is also closely related to the CLK in a minute. This brings us to our first nuance, which I think is a huge exterior nuance. Basically, the front third of the C55 AMG is not even from a W203 C-Class at all. It's from the W209, or the C209, to be more exact. It looks completely different, but in a very subtle way. So what I'm saying is that the front fenders, bumper, headlights, etc., were all taken directly from the CLK. Why? It wasn't just done for looks, although I do personally think it dramatically changes the look of the car compared to the base C-Class headlights and front clip. And I've got compliments from people who just couldn't quite place why it was different, asking me where I got the headlights, which are stock. And it was swapped by AMG for the primary purpose of adding a few extra inches between the front axle and the firewall so that they could fit the big honkin' 5.4-liter V8 under the hood. One thing to remember if you're shopping for one of these is to keep in mind that from an ownership and maintenance perspective, you have to be aware that some of the parts must be ordered to fit the C209 CLK, and some of the parts must be ordered to fit the W203. So it's a little bit of a Frankenstein type car in that respect. And not every part shop will know what to look for if you just tell them you're looking for parts for a C-Class from 2005. So you got to make sure you say it's AMG, and even then, sometimes you may have to order parts for the CLK. Let's talk powertrain and performance. This brings us to the biggest gadget of all for the C55. The 5.4-liter naturally aspirated V8. Historically, hot rodding typically involves stuffing a large engine into a small car. And that's exactly what AMG has done here. The other cool nuance about real AMG engines is that they were all built by hand and signed by their builders. And they have a plaque on the engine that shows this and has the signature. The V8 engine is rated at 362 horsepower, 376 foot-pounds of torque. Those were better power numbers than the haloed 5.7 liter LS1 in the C5 Corvette, which only put out 350 horsepower and 360 foot-pound of torque. So speaking of the Corvette, I have driven the C5, and I would say that the C55 really feels a lot like a four-door C5 Corvette, especially in terms of the drivetrain. While the curb weight of the C55 is 300 to 400 pounds more than the Corvette at just over 3,500, the 0 to 60 time is only 0.2 of a second slower than the C5 at 4.9 seconds for the C55. Now, going back for a minute to the M3 comparison with regards to the powertrain, the E46 M3 had a 3.2 liter inline six. Horsepower rating was only 30 less than the C55 at 333 horsepower, but the 5.4 liter V8 had a huge advantage in torque at 376, which was over 100 more foot-pounds than the 262, kind of pathetic, torque spec on the M car. And so this extra torque really helps the car feel faster in everyday situations. It also makes the V8, also the V8 sounds much better, and I'll cover that in the driving part of the review. Lastly, I'll mention that in the used market and enthusiast communities, the M is still somewhat preferred over the C55 for one reason. The BMW is available with a manual transmission, and the C55 was not. It was automatic only. However, I found that the 5-speed automatic actually is pretty good. I will get into that a little bit later in the driving segment, but I found it to be pretty responsive when you knew how to drive it, when you knew it was going to shift, especially when you put it in sport mode or when you use the paddles. But yeah, once in a while it would kind of do its own thing. So enough introduction and comparison to the rivals. Let's move on to the exterior nuances and gadgets. So exterior styling, first of all, even though it's a compact sedan, the four doors really make it more practical for those with families. Even though it's an AMG, it still has a very conservative design. There's no big wings or scoops anywhere, just straight, clean body lines with a subtle curve to it around the edges. Most people would not think twice about seeing this car in traffic, as it looks so similar to the regular C-Class, which makes it a great sleeper, except for a couple minor details which indicates that something else is under the hood. Aside from the sport body kit and bigger wheels and brakes, the first clue that the C55 AMG is packing more of a punch is the badge, which the AMG badge is very subtle. There was no fender badges originally on this model, but many people added them because they did come on the later models, the C63. And another thing that there's four of on this car besides the doors is the exhaust tips. The car had quad exhaust tips, which is another clue that the big V8 is hiding under the hood. And the C55 is the first C-Class to have quad exhaust. While quad exhaust is very common nowadays, anything sporty or performance-oriented has it. It wasn't quite that common back on compact sedans in 2005. I already covered the different front clip earlier, but I'll just say again how much I really love the way it changes the look of the car compared to the normal C-Class. And by 2005, Mercedes was deep into its round headlight era. So the C55 was no exception, as similar looking lights were featured on the CLK, the SL, the E-Class, even the SLR McLaren. The C55 is the last C-Class AMG to have a raised hood star. I've always loved the raised hood star on Mercedes. It really makes it feel like a premium brand. And while we're up here, another exterior gadget is the HID headlights with HID headlight washers, which I believe were a requirement in Europe, but obviously they carried over. So the little nozzles pop up to spray the headlights when the headlights are on. And lastly, before we go inside, there's one very cool gadget on the door. It has an infrared key that can control the windows going up and down from outside the car. You just hold the key next to the door and you hold unlock to put them down and you hold lock to put them up, and it'll even close the sunroof as well. Moving inside the C55's interior nuances and gadgets, I'll start with the rear and mention that there's no rear door pockets for kids to leave any kind of sticky messes, which is kind of unusual nowadays. All the doors have pockets, but I actually love this one because as a dad, I've definitely cleaned some gooey stuff out of door pockets, and so you don't get any door pockets in this car. There's several interesting dash buttons besides the usual heated seats. First, there's a power rear sunshade to keep the sun off the heads of your precious backseat passengers. Next, the rear headrests flip down with a push of a button. This is for visibility while the back seat is unoccupied. It's still a compact car, and when you put the rear seat headrests up, it does block the rear view a little bit, so you can flip the headrest down with the push of a button, so you don't have to reach back there and fiddle with it. We also have the fishhook button again. So if you've seen my W210 E-Class wagon video, you would already know what this is, but it's basically there to disable the alarm when the car is being towed. The car has an aftermarket Android head unit, which I think looks great and really integrates well and updates the interior. And this car was never available with any kind of backup camera, but now it has one. And it also retains the OEM steering wheel controls, which is really nice. And it somehow hooks into the CAN bus system to also know when the doors are open. And I think that's a pretty cool gadget that makes the head unit seem even more like an OEM unit. One cool gadget is right on the door panel where you have all the seat controls shaped like a seat. That's pretty common in Mercedes-Benz models. You can actually still find this on modern Mercedes as well. The steering wheel and the seat can be set up to move back. So they sort of retract the steering wheel and pull your seat back. So when you get out of the car, it's a lot easier because again, it is sort of a compact car. So this, and especially with the side bolsters of the AMG seats, it's a lot easier getting in and out if you have them automatically retract for you. The other neat feature here is that the headrest is motorized, which means you don't have to reach behind your head to move it up and down yourself in your luxurious German sedan. The headrest also moves automatically with the seat, so they're assuming that a larger person will want more legroom, want also a higher headrest setting. Note the styling nuances of the AMG interior. AMG seats with special stitching and suede inserts with perforated leather, the AMG logos on the seats. They also added an AMG V8 logo to the gauge cluster, which has an AMG specific 200 mile an hour speedometer. The top speed was limited to 155, but reportedly, if you had the limiter removed, you could hit about 187, which is pretty quick. Another interesting control in here is in the center console next to the gear lever, there's a switch marked C and S, so you can choose between comfort and sport. That basically adjusts the transmission shifts points and how hard it shifts. Sport would make your car shift kind of at a higher RPM and hold the gears a little longer. And there's also a manual mode if you flip the gear shift to the left or right while driving, or there's paddle shifts that are hidden on the back of the steering wheel. So you can use those switches to shift while you're driving. Next to the control for the power windows, child lock, and the cup holder in the center console is kind of an interesting gadget. It pops up and reveals a second cup holder. I kind of hate this design and would rather have just had a single larger fixed cup holder. The pop-up one is very flimsy and frequently breaks. I've had to replace this part because they do break easily. And if you're buying one of these, make sure to check that functionality. The rear seat center armrest also has two cup holders, which has sort of an interesting nuance in that they're slightly different sizes. So I guess for a larger cup and sort of can size one. There's also an ashtray and cigarette lighter in the rear for the kids, because why not? You had a screen in the gauge cluster. Along with standard old school analog gauges, you have the screen in the middle that, was early 2000s, so it didn't have color or show you lots of different things, but you could go through the different screens and it showed you like where your radio was tuned to and when your oil change was due and other trip odometer stuff. But one nuance here that I found confusing is that there's a screen that just says distance. And it took me a while to realize that this was the remaining distance on your tank of gas. And I'm not sure why Mercedes didn't use the word range if they wanted to keep it short and only use a single word, but they definitely had room to be a bit more descriptive here, and they didn't. There is a secret oil level check menu. There's no dipstick in this car, but it will tell you when you're low on oil, and it will tell you to put a quart of oil in at the next gas station. But if you put your key in the on position, you move the cluster to mileage, and then you push the odometer reset button 3 times, it'll pull up a secret menu where you can actually see the amount of oil in the system in liters. Semi-automatic wipers. You turn those on, and then they're automatic based on a sensor. So it's not fully automatic. You still turn them on and off, but then they'll adjust to the amount of rain. The center console, yes, the car originally came with a phone that was built in the center console. You could lift the lid, and there was a Mercedes-Benz branded cell phone that was there, but this car no longer has it. One cool thing is that there's a center console latch on the front and on the sides. And so if you use one of the ones on the sides, it reveals a smaller upper area, but if you pull up the lid, it reveals a much larger storage area. But the cool gadget here is that the buttons on both sides can open up either way. So you can open it up toward the passenger with the driver's side button, or you can open up toward the driver with the passenger side button. So it's kind of magic how they figured that out. In the rear, we have the first thing you notice, again, besides that there's no door pockets, is just that door solidity. The doors are very solid, even in the back. There's a rear climate vent back here, which is a nice touch and probably pretty rare on compact cars of the early 2000s. The trunk in the C55 is a pretty good size. I love that everything is covered with carpet, which feels pretty luxurious, and, or plastic cladding. And so there's no like exposed metal and stuff back here for the most part. One gadget is the emergency trunk release button, which lights up and blinks so that you can escape the trunk if you're ever trapped inside. The rear seats also fold down, which is great, very handy and pretty convenient if you need to have any bulky items that you need to move. In the cargo area, it's worth pointing out that there's a first aid kit strapped inside on one side, although I'd probably be a bit worried about using the Band-Aids in that first aid kit. They might be losing their stick. And we're going to move on to driving the C55 AMG. All right, driving the C55 AMG. I've got to say, I absolutely love driving the C55 AMG. I'm not a big guy, only about 5'7", so I really feel like this car fits me perfectly in terms of size. It might be a bit cramped for larger drivers. It is a C-Class, but I have owned this for about 2 years, and it's been super reliable, aside from typical German car nuances. It drives very comfortable, but still sporty. It's super responsive. It doesn't really want to be rushed too much in terms of steering and body roll. It's not as responsive as like a Porsche Cayman or a Boxster or anything of that nature. It doesn't handle as well as a 911, obviously, but you do feel that it has some handling capability. It just is very non-dramatic. And the one thing it does respond to very well, though, is the throttle. Woo! Boy, this thing goes. It's got some serious get up to it, and I think that is so much fun, and this car is so much fun for it because you just don't expect it. It just looks like an unassuming C-Class, and you don't expect it to have 370 horsepower. I love the car. It's just comfortable, it's quick, it does everything well. It's really more of a red light to red light kind of racer, or even a high speed, highway cruiser, than it is like a canyon carver. And I suppose that, combined with the manual transmission, is really why more enthusiasts gravitate toward the M3 over the C55. They say it's more of a driver's car and has the manual and better weight distribution, etc. But the C55 makes for a great daily driver. It's automatic. You get stuck in traffic. You don't have to worry about it. Also, a lot of the M3s came with that sequential manual transmission, which had problems sometimes. So this one is super reliable. This car has a lot of miles on it, and it's still, kicking and doing great. And then there's the paddle shifters, which is a little bit slow to respond, but they give you that extra control over the transmission. And I really do like the older hydraulic steering feel. A lot of these modern cars have the electric power steering, which I'm still not quite used to yet. And it is somewhat tossable, but it's really not the most sporty handling. It just feels planted, no drama. The traction control is very good. And I love how understated it is too. I get compliments from people all the time that would never guess that it's 20 years old. Lots of people tell me how much they love the exhaust. I've gotten this from random strangers at gas stations or in traffic. And one's a pharmacist at the drive-thru kept asking about the headlights, and he couldn't quite put his finger on how they were different than the normal 203 C-Class that he was familiar with. And he kept asking me if they were aftermarket, but he didn't believe that they were stock because they do have that interesting look to them compared to a C-Class. And lastly, like I said, the traction control program is good. I leave it on most of the time. But even with it off, it's actually pretty easy to control in a slide. I don't know if it's still on to some extent, but it's not all over the place, like Mustangs running into crowds. And with that, it's time to give this C55 a max score. And the max score here is 70 out of 100. Performance, I gave it a 7 out of 10. The 5.4 liter V8 makes the car a blast to drive with tons of power on tap and a 5-second 0 to 60, but it has relatively little rubber, and therefore it's limited in the handling department. And it's limited in the grip department. And so there's no limited slip differential to really make use of all the power. And the steering, people could say it's a tad numb, especially when you're on comfort mode, but it gets a 7 out of 10. It's solid performance. Styling, 6 out of 10, has modern classic lines, but still looks like an old Mercedes to most people. And so many newer vehicles are just nicer looking. So it gets a 6 out of 10. It's also not kind of winning any awards at car shows or getting a lot of attention there necessarily. But that's also why it's a good sleeper. Daily, 7 out of 10. I did semi-daily drive this for a while, and it's very great as a daily. It is super versatile with the rear seats and the doors, especially if you have kids. So the one drawback as a daily is that it's terrible on gas, especially if you're driving around town all the time and you're getting into the throttle. You're getting like probably 13 miles per gallon. And it is a bit cramped with 4 people in the car. So you really, the back seat is kind of better for children. So it gets a 7 out of 10 as a daily. Weekend score is about special enough to only take out on the weekend. And I know that some owners of these do have them as weekend cars, and low mileage examples will show you that's what some people are doing with them, but it is pretty rare. So it does get some looks at car shows, especially Mercedes events where people know what it is. But again, it's not known by everyone, so it gets a 6 out of 10. Value, 9 out of 10. These cars are available for a huge discount off the original MSRP, which was over $50,000 in 2005. And they're basically fully depreciated at this point. They're not going to lose any value. Most higher mileage examples like this one are trading under $10,000. And there were only 1,500 ever sold in the US. So they are pretty rare. There were more of them overseas, and those are, I believe, starting to be allowed to import soon. So you'll probably see some imported models soon because they did have a wagon overseas, which is nice. But still, you get a ton of bang for your buck. You add that in with a reliable drivetrain, and you've got a great car for your money. So it gets a 9 out of 10. The overall max score is 70 out of 100. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.